Today we're going to talk about creating the best visualizations for your data. And the outline for the talk will start with a bit about what visualizations are, or what I think they are. And then we'll talk about the process of creating a visualization, which begins with choosing the type of chart you want to make. And that is based upon the message you want the chart to send and the data that you have available to you. Then we'll look at four major categories of charts, types of charts. There are multiple individual types of charts within each of these categories. And there are a few other charts that really don't fit well into these categories. We'll discuss some of those. And along the way, we're going to talk a little bit about some best practices for making good charts. I'm using the word chart throughout because visualization is a bit wordy. And then finally, we'll wrap things up. So what do I mean by data visualization? Well, a visualization of data is representing the content of the data with shapes that have colors and positions in a 2D space, an image, essentially, a 2D image. And it's important to understand that, from my point of view at least, a visualization is where the content is derived from the data. It's not a drawing, it's not artistic. There can be some style to it, but it should really represent what's in the data. And particularly in a scientific environment, or you want to be accurate, or you'll get yourself into trouble. Visualizations can be used for multiple things. One thing you can do with them is you can learn about your data. You can get some insight about the data from looking at pictures of it. But you could also tell a story about your data, which is what most people, I think of is they want to convey some kind of a message to an audience, and a visualization can make that easier. Especially if the concepts are a bit difficult, viewers might understand it better if they see it than if they just hear a lot of words about it. As has been said for many years, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think that's true with visualizations of substantial data. So you can do different things with these visualizations. I break them down into two broad categories. One is explanatory purposes. So that's when you want to convey the information in a slideshow, a talk, or maybe you have a paper or a web page, and you want to present information and explain to people what they're seeing. And a different use for visualizations is exploratory. If you've got some data and you want to understand what's in it better, you might want to make images of it, multiple images, just for your own understanding. Sort of walk around in the data, look at it from different points of view. And one way that some people do this is they build a dashboard that has parameters in it. The dashboard shows the image, the visualization, and then you can slide these different parameters around to slice and dice the data and highlight the parts of it you want to see. In the end, really the same techniques are used for making both kinds of visualizations. You know, a good-looking visualization that you would want in a talk could also be more useful to you if you're exploring your data. But all the examples I'm going to present today are for using explanatory style visualizations, and you should just feel free to assume that you could use those same techniques for any other visualization you want to make. So what are the steps for making a great visualization? As I mentioned in the overview, choosing the chart type is the thing you really need to start with. I think a lot of people think that, okay, I need to make a chart. Let me fire up Excel or Tableau or whatever it is you're using, and then what? You know, I don't know where to start. Well, if you pick the wrong type of chart by accident or willfully, you're going to wind up hitting a dead end where you're not getting the chart to show what you want it to show. So this is really what I'm focusing on today, is how to pick the right chart type. It's the most important thing, because the software does not know what you want to show. You know, it might know your data, some things about your data, but beyond that, you've got to tell it what to do. It can make it look pretty. It can make it neat and pleasing to the eye, but it could be meaningless if you have chosen the wrong kind of chart. So once you've built your initial chart, you might want to modify it a bit to improve it, to make it more impactful. One of the things that used to be a problem is that you would have these charts right out of the software that would not be very attractive, or they'd be a little bit cluttered. I have to say software is doing a lot better nowadays in that area. So the second step here of clarifying the content, removing the distractions, is not as important. Most of the distractions that wind up in charts nowadays are put there by the authors who are trying to do too much, let's say. We'll talk about a little bit about that. And we'll also talk about what you can do then once you have a chart that is clear. You can add things to the chart that will focus the viewer's attention on the things you want them to pay attention to, the emphasis of your chart. So we'll give some examples of how you can do this. This is something I'd love to go into more detail on, but we don't really have the time today. So I'll give you just a taste of it. So how do you choose the right chart type? Well, where am I at here? Sorry. You need to ask yourself 2 questions before you start making a chart. What message do you want the chart to send? And what data do you have available to make the chart? So the message is something that I think a lot of people don't think about. They just think about showing the data. Well, sure, you could just dump the data into a chart, but that's going to leave a lot for the viewer to figure out for themselves. They're going to have to study it and assess it and try to come to this. You hope that they'll come to the same conclusion that you do. But if you have an intention ahead of time that the chart will show something specific about that data, you're going to wind up with a much better result. And of course, that you have to have the right data available to show that message. So you should do a survey of the data you have. Think about what the characteristics and types of that data are, and from there you can begin to choose a chart type and begin construction. So this is commonly referred. This chart here is not mine. It's commonly referred to as Dr. Abella's chart chooser, and we're going to take a look at this multiple times throughout the talk, and at the end I'll have a link to it. You can find it pretty easily online. What the process for using this chart chooser is to start in the middle and answer the question of what would you like to show? What is the message you want your chart to give? And the messages that you might have will typically fall into one of 4 categories of showing a comparison between bits of the data, or a composition, how the whole of the data is made up of the different parts, how the data is distributed, or relationships between some of the variables in the data. And when you follow one of those 4 paths out from the center, then you'll see you've got these little branches in the tree, and the branches that you take are dependent on aspects of your data. Do you have a lot of data points or just a few? What kind of data do you have? What are other characteristics of it? And then if you follow those paths, you'll wind up around the outside of the diagram here at one of those different chart types. Now, that's not to say that that's the only type of chart you could make that would do a good job, but it is a helpful way to have you think through the process of deciding what kind of chart to make, to being conscious of the particular data that you have in this instance of chart building. And so don't take this to be written in stone, but it is a great way to get you started thinking. That's what the title says. It's a thought starter. It gets you thinking about what kind of a chart you should be making. So we'll come back to this as we go along. So your chart's message. Well, first of all, you can't really have a message that says you're going to show something that isn't in the data to begin with. So you got to be realistic about it. You want to choose a message that you really can support with the data. Now, if you have multiple things that you want to say, you may plan to have multiple charts. If you're giving a talk, for example, uh, you could build up a logical argument for something by using successive charts that show different aspects of your argument. It's tempting sometimes to try to get everything into one chart, but often you'll just confuse the viewers. They'll be overwhelmed by trying to parse out what they see. So don't feel like you need to do that. Just keep things tidy. The thing I like to do is to think of what would a title be for this chart. What am I telling the viewer that they should see in the chart? You could actually plan a talk out and just have placeholders for all of your charts um, if you make good titles for them, and then come back later and make those charts. So this is where you should start thinking about your message. And here's some examples of the types of messages you might have. And these are not, I have them colored here because each pair of them in the same color correspond to one of the categories that I just named. So in a comparison chart, you might be saying this particular item's value is the highest or the lowest among all the ones that I'm showing you. Or you could say, this is how it has changed over time. So comparison charts will involve time. Sometimes you want to show people a pattern of change. If it's a composition chart, you might be saying the whole of this realm is made up from these parts. Or you could say within all the parts of this whole, this one is the largest. You know, the sales for widgets were made up 50% of of all of our profit for this past quarter. That's like a business example of composition chart. Going on to distribution charts, you could say that the data is distributed in this way. There are the outliers that stand apart from the rest, or there are these clusters that you can see. And for relationship charts, you're saying these two variables seem to be related strongly in the data, and these particular items are like each other in this way. Sorry, these are generic statements that I'm hoping you can imagine how you would use them in a more specific way, given whatever data you had to use. Speaking of your data, I encourage you to start by thinking of your data as a collection of sample points. You know, you may have one table of data, but each element of it is a sample point. So you may be plotting each of those individual sample points, but you might also be aggregating those sample points and coming up with some numbers that you could also plot, like the average of some value, or the standard deviation, the minimum, the maximum value, the count, the number of sample points you have. These are not in your data, but they can be derived from your data. And other things can be derived from the data as well. You can calculate a lot of different things. I imagine you, in your work, you probably could think of some examples of that. So what we're going to do then is take the variables that are in our sample points of data, and perhaps some of these aggregate variables that we generate, and we'll find ways to map them to positions in the chart, or shapes, or colors, so that they present a visual representation of the data to the viewer. And some forms of representation work better than others for different types of variables. So let's talk a bit about the different types of data. So I'm going to claim here that there are two main types of data, numerical data and categorical data. And numerical data, I'm going to lump into that dates and times. Categorical data has to do with things that have names. We'll look a little more closely at each of these types of data. Also, you want to have some sense of how many sample points you have. Are you going to try to show a lot of things in one chart, or just a few? Does the data have a cyclical pattern to it? For instance, is it quarterly data that goes over 3 years? You know, so the quarter 1, 2, 3, 4 of the first year, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the second year. That's a cyclical pattern to the data that could influence the way you present it. And how many dimensions are there for each sample in the data? Sorry, let me just say a little more about that. When I talk about dimensions, I'm talking about the values that are associated with a sample. So sometimes you might have an experiment, let's say, where you're applying a certain voltage and the environment has a certain pressure and a certain temperature, and you've recorded these things, and then you take some readings from the experiment that you're doing, let's say. And so all of those different numbers are dimensions of that sample point. You may be looking for correlations between some of those dimensions when you're presenting the data. You might be ignoring some of them because they're not relevant for the particular message you're trying to send. That's what I mean when I talk about dimensions of a sample of the data. Okay. So looking a little more closely at numerical data, I'm going to claim that that can be broken down into two different types of numbers: discrete numbers like integers, and continuous numbers, also known as real numbers. So examples of discrete numbers are a population count. You could say there are 30,045 people living in Ithaca. You can't have 30,045 and a half people living in Ithaca. No, it's an integer. Someone's age is an integer. The number of units that were sold by some store, number of home runs a player hit. So it often doesn't matter too much whether you're dealing with integers or real numbers, but it's good to be conscious of it because on occasion it will play a role in the way you choose to chart things. Dates and times, an argument can be made that these are real numbers, or you could say they're integers. Like if it's days, a date on a calendar, that's more like an integer. But if you take time and you go to hours and minutes and seconds, at some point it starts to feel like a real number where you could plot it on an axis, but not just on the little tick marks of the axis. So that's not as firm of a statement as some of the other ones I'm making here. And when I was talking about the aggregate values that you can calculate for a large set of data sample points, one of those aggregate values, the count, is an integer. The other ones are like the average and the standard deviation. Those are real numbers. And so in that second section there, the examples of real numbers are temperatures, voltages, things that you might measure in an experiment or in the real world, or things that you could calculate like a percentage. So both of these types of numerical data can always be positioned along an axis somewhere. There's an understood position on any given axis where a value would fall if it has one of these types, assuming it's within the range of that axis. Categorical data is a little trickier. There's also two types of that. Ordinal categorical data is something where there's an understood ordering to the names, the words that are in this category. So, for example, with months, if I ask you what's the first month, you would know that it's January. And if I ask you to list them all out in order, everyone would agree on what the ordering is. So you could actually plot the months of the year by name across an axis, because everyone would agree that they're 1 month apart on the axis and they come in a certain order. The same is largely true with days of the week. There might be some argument as to which day begins the week. Letter grades for a course, A, B, C, D, and fiscal quarters in the business world. These things all have names more so than a numerical value, but they have an understood ordering. Now, other types of categorical data that is not ordinal we'll call nominal data, and this is where there's no meaningful ordering of the values. And I have examples there of countries and fruits and animals. If you're plotting things, if you're listing things alphabetically, then aardvark comes first before bear. But it doesn't mean that an aardvark is a better thing or a more important thing than a bear. So it's important that you not try to display nominal data in an ordered fashion as if it was ordinal, because you'll be giving it meaning that it doesn't actually have. And some nominal data particularly the type that, well, I have examples here. Some nominal data has an association with geospatial location in the world. So if I gave you the name of a country, you might picture the outline of that country. And certainly in software, the perimeter, the boundary of that country could be known and used for graphing purposes. Same for a lake, or for line features like rivers, or point features like the centers of cities. So this will come into play late in the talk, but I want you to think about that, how some nominal data has meaning outside of just the word that is the name of the category there. Let's see. So, as I mentioned earlier, and it's good to see it again here, the 4 common chart categories are comparison, composition, distribution, and relationship. And I'm going to go through each of those in that order. Most types of charts that you see will fall into one of these categories, but occasionally you'll see charts that combine categories, or perhaps do something completely outside of this realm. But usually, when you think of a message you want to send, it's going to fit one of those categories, or perhaps a combination of them. So that's why you should start with thinking what you want to say, then go and say, well, what category is that? And then begin your journey through the chart chooser. So while we're doing this, we're going to see that certain combinations of numerical data and category data can't be used in some kinds of charts, or some charts only work with one bit of numerical data and another bit of categorical data. Some chart types work very well with time-based data and others do not. And sometimes charts will not be suitable if you've got a lot of data points, a lot of values, particularly categorical data where you've got a lot of names to try to display. Or if there's a lot of sample points, it can overwhelm some types of charts. They can't display all that at once. And the number of variables you try to display at once in one chart can also be limited in a given chart type. You need to be aware that if you try to do too much, you're going to fail. So, Steve, are there any questions at this point?
There are none so far.
Excellent. Okay, let's dive into comparison charts. And this is where I'll spend a little more time than some of the other categories, because comparison charts are the most used types of charts. I believe that. I've read it, but I believe it because when you see which charts are in this family, you'll say, oh yeah, I've made those, or I've seen a lot of those. These charts compare how a variable, one variable over multiple categories. I think these words will make more sense when you see the examples. Or you could use them to show how a variable changes over time. And here are some of the most common types of comparison charts: column and bar charts and line charts. So I have a little bit of sample data here that I'm going to work with. This is crop production from 2016. The values are given in millions of tons. You can see that every row is the data for one country, and every column is the data for one type of crop. Just some sample data. It's real data, but it's pretty limited, just for helping us get started here. So the first type of chart we're going to look at is a column chart. And you may look at that and say, oh, that's a bar chart. Well, some people will use that name for this type of chart, but I think it's good to call this a column chart because the display really is vertical, like in a column, and bar chart is horizontal, which we'll see that in a little bit. So I'm going to call these column charts. Just when you use certain software, you may find names that they use for a given type of chart that are unfamiliar to you. Look at the little picture of how they say the chart will look, and then you may be able to associate it with the name you use. So what we've done here is we've taken the orange row of data for the country of Italy, and we've plotted those 3 values, each in their own column, and labeled below with the name of the crop that they produce. So you can look at this chart and see that Italy produces more grapes than either of the other crops. And here I must apologize. All of the examples I have of little charts here don't follow what I would say is a golden rule, which is to make the chart title tell you the message of the chart. This is just a vague statement. Hey, this is some crop data from Italy in 2016. It should say something like, Italy, grapes are the top crop in Italy in 2016, something like that. So don't do as I do here. I apologize for that. Perhaps as an exercise to the viewer, you can think of what would be a good title for all the charts you're seeing here. So that's a nice simple chart. Almost everyone would have no trouble using Excel to make that. In fact, a lot of the charts here are from Excel, this one included. It's a better tool than it used to be. It's not a bad place to start if you're just trying to make a quick and dirty chart, but a great chart. So we could turn this on its side and instead show grape production in 2016 for the 4 different countries. And we still have the same thing, the 4 columns, each labeled with the country that it represents. And here we can see that Italy produces the most grapes. What if we wanted to show all of the data in this table, all 12 items at once? Well, we can do that with a column chart, but we've got to break it down. We got to introduce something that shows us that additional dimension. So now the dimensions are the country and the crop. So the crop is delineated by these 3 clusters of columns, and the country is shown as different colors. So if you start to use color, you're going to need to put a legend into your chart, and most charting software will do that for you by default. You might choose colors that have some meaning for the particular countries, if you can, or for the crops, depending on how you're organizing it. Otherwise, just let the software choose benign colors that don't really try to indicate anything. You need to be aware when you're using color if you're sending a meaning that you don't intend. Sometimes it's better to take the color out if you don't want any additional meaning to be inferred when it doesn't really exist. So what I like about this chart is you can answer a number of different questions. You could say, I could ask you, what's the top crop produced by Turkey? So you look at the legend, you see Turkey's red, boom, it jumps right out at you, tomatoes. Or you could say, what's the top crop produced by France? Same thing. Or who produces the most grapes? And you go over to the grape thing and look at the tallest column, and then you see it's green, you go over to the legend, oh, it's Italy. So this chart has a lot of good information that isn't very hard to access. If you had a particular message you wanted to send, you might want to augment, give a good title to the chart and augment the presentation to call attention to that thing that you wanted to show.
Say, Ben?
So, yes.
Can I try a quick question on that one?
Yes.
Why not do it the other way? Why not have the countries on the with the colors representing the different crops?
There's no reason to not do it the other way. I could have chosen that just as easily. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I guess it's just a choice of what you want to show the most, I suppose.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if you wanted to, this example is pretty generic, but there are situations where you could show it either way, the columns versus the rows, and yet one of them will be more appropriate for your message. In this case, it's not really a big deal. So here's what I'm calling a bar chart, what a lot of people call a bar chart. You're just taking those columns and turning them on the side. This presentation is almost identical, but it has a few advantages. One is, if you've got a lot of categories that you want to show, if you try to show them as columns, you're going to start to run out of space to give them nice labels down below. But here in the horizontal orientation, it's easy. You could have dozens of bars with the labels to their left-hand side. And in fact, what some software will let you do is put the labels right on top of the bars, which can actually help the viewer see things, and it can save you some of your horizontal space if you've got a large range of bar lengths. Speaking of bar lengths, that's how these charts are working with your brain. They are presenting to you things that you can evaluate as being relative to each other in size, and so that's what's happening here. And if I don't blab too much, we'll get to seeing how that is important in other areas. I'm gonna have to keep moving so I don't run out of time. Um, so column charts can also be used to show how a variable changes over time. Here in this table, I've got data for orange production in 4 countries over 17 years, and the orange section highlights 6 of those years. So years are 1 unit apart on an axis, the x-axis, and so showing a succession of columns allows your eye to sort of move across the top of those and see which years are higher than other years. What's the pattern? It rises, it falls, it rises again. This will work for a reasonable number of columns, but if you start to get too many, it's going to be harder to read, and it's not really the best choice. So let's look at an alternative. If you're going to go for all 17 years of data, it's time to switch over to using a line chart. So a line chart draws from the left side to the right side of your graph because the time axis should always be presented on the x-axis. And then the value is the height, the y on the y-axis. And one of the things that's nice about the line chart is if your data is missing for 1 year, you can just skip from the previous point to the next point. The line just skips over that point, and you're not really misrepresenting anything. If you had columns and you had a year that was missing, it would sort of jump out. It would be a bit jarring to the viewer, but it would be truthful in that you don't know what to show for that year. So if you remember that chart, let's go back, we had 4 rows of data. We can show all 4 of those at one time if we give each country a color, and that's what's been done here. This works well if all of the Y ranges are very similar. If you have one row of data that's 10 times as high as everything else, it's going to compress those other ones all down into, they'll just look like flat lines down at the bottom of your chart, and so it doesn't work so well there. But in this example, it's easy to see that there's a bit of a pattern to some of the countries, like Turkey is increasing over time. There's a lot of variability in Spain, the yellow one, from year to year. Italy had one great year, and so forth. So you could tell a lot of different messages with a chart like this. If you don't really need to show all of what's happening between the beginning and the end, you just sort of want to show the overall result over a time span, you can use something called a slope graph. So a slope graph simplifies that presentation to being one value at the beginning and one value at the end with a straight line in between them. And one of the things that this does a nice job of showing clearly is when there's a change in the ordinality of the categories. So at the beginning of this time frame, Italy was the 2nd largest producer of oranges, but by the end, they were the 3rd largest producer. They had dropped below Turkey. It was very clear here where it was a little more complicated in the previous chart. This chart was made with Tableau, so it looks a little different from the other ones that I've shown. Now, we talked a bit about cyclic data. If you've got data that moves in a cyclic way, you could choose to plot it. Instead of plotting it on a Cartesian chart, which all of the other charts we've seen have been, x-axis horizontal, y-axis is vertical. Here, the 2 axes are going around the circle clockwise from the top around, and then radially from the center out is the equivalent of the y-axis. So if you look, you see the dates, the months go clockwise from the top, and the data here are the average temperatures in each month in different cities of the world. I'm going to call your attention first to the green and the yellow rings, which are Manaus, Brazil, and Quito, Ecuador. These cities are both very close to the equator, so it's not surprising that when you see them, their temperatures are very consistent all year long. But Quito is way up in the mountains, so its temperatures are a lot lower than Manaus, which is in the middle of the Amazon. And then the other 2, Paris is blue and Sydney, Australia is red. They're in opposite hemispheres, and so they're both shifted a bit where they're going to be warmer one time a year and colder another time, and they're shifted in the opposite directions because they're in different hemispheres. One thing you should know about this type of a chart is that that radial axis from the center on out has to either be all positive or all negative numbers. Really should be. I suppose you could try to fudge this, but the value of 0 in the middle there would make it hard for us to show average temperatures in Moscow, for example, which are probably negative. So there are some limitations to this chart. What you could do if you had multiple years of data for one city is just have the ring go around and around, and maybe you could so essentially you're showing more data for one category that way. If you had 10 years of data, it would sort of start to overwrite itself. But you can use this type of chart when you have cyclical data if it seems like it does a better job of presenting the story for you. And this is another type of comparison chart called a small multiples. So the word multiples in this case means there are multiple small charts within one big chart, essentially a table of charts. So people call it a grid chart, table chart, a lattice chart. So having multiple charts allows you to show one more dimension of your data. So each individual chart has the categories of some countries and then the value of their population. And now by having multiple charts, we add in another dimension, the variable of the year in which the presentation is being made. So you have to look around a bit in here to see a story. But let me say I called this chart Mexico's population growth. Look in the upper left-hand chart and find Mexico. It's right in the middle of the list of. Oh, let me help you with that. Mexico's here. So it's pretty short back in 1960, but as you watch it moving from row to row, it starts to get longer and longer until back here in 2008, it's quite high. So you could tell a story like that across all of these charts in a small multiples. If you really wanted to, you could arrange this table such that the x-axis of the table showed different values of one dimension and the y-axis showed different values of another dimension. So you'd essentially be adding 2 dimensions worth of information. It could be a little hard for the viewers to understand that, so you'd have to do a good job of bringing them along with some annotations that showed what you were trying to portray. Okay, so here's a zoom in on the comparison section. I'm assuming here that we started in the middle of the Dr. Abella's diagram. We knew we wanted a comparison chart, and then we asked ourselves, well, is that chart going to be over time or among different items? At first, we went the items route, and we found our way down here to the column chart and then the bar chart. This few categories thing here, we actually only had one category. You can see these examples here are showing 2 different categories. We eventually did switch to having a multiple category column chart. This was the chart we ended with here because we had many categories to show. So it was a little table of smaller charts. Over here in the time-based charts, we started with just a few periods, and we had a column chart, and then we realized, well, we have more periods of time now. I'm sorry, that's over here. We used a single line to show that, and then we added more categories, and we had a line chart with multiple lines in it. And finally, we had cyclical data, and we showed it with the circular area chart. So these words can be a little confusing here when we go back and try to map them to what we're saying, what we said when we were looking at the charts. But I encourage you after the talk to look at this chart and think a bit about how these words lead you to these particular chart types. So I'm going to take a little break here from telling you about the different categories of charts to talk about some best practices. So after you've made your chart, there's some things you can do to make the chart better. And I'm breaking this down into 3 things: presenting your data accurately, creating clarity, and or not ruining clarity that may already be at the chart, and then finally focusing the viewer's attention. So I'm going to show examples here that are all comparison charts, which is what we've talked about so far. But you really you could use these same principles and apply them to the other types of charts as well. So here's my little lecture on accuracy. It's important to accurately represent your data in your chart. You don't want to tell lies with your chart. One way in which you can tell a lie is with a column chart or a bar chart. If your brain is interpreting the lengths of the bars to be relative to each other in an absolute way, then those bars must go down to zero. That axis must go down to zero. And here's an example on the left. If you look at this bar on the left here, and then you look at the bar on the right seems to be 4 times as tall as the one on the left. Quite a dramatic change in the welfare received in the US over that time span. Most people will just let that soak into their brain, and they won't come over here to the left and look at the y-axis and realize, oh my gosh, that's not going down to zero. If you take that same data and you plot it all the way down to zero, well, the story is not quite so dramatic, right? In fact, there's no story at all. So if you do this in a scientific paper, you're asking for a lot of trouble. So please always be aware of how the visualization you're creating is actually working in someone's brain, that it's the vertical height that is striking them and giving them information. They're not necessarily going to look at the numbers to see what is meant there. So I'm off my soapbox now, but clarity is, I want to say that modern software has made this less of a problem than it was before. If you generate a chart, the default chart you get uses pleasing color palettes and puts in good axes and grid lines to be informative but not too distracting. It's when people try to use the fancy features of the software and they add in background images and special effects and patterns and things that they wind up distracting the viewer. The viewer's brain sees these things, and before they can move on to understanding the chart, they try to make sense of them. Is this important? Do I need to worry about this? The absence of all of those distractions is much better than making something look cool because you know how to do it. You know, it's more about the information. If you simplify it, clarify it, then you'll be able to focus the viewer's attention on certain things. And we'll talk about that shortly here. Another way to provide some clarity is by sorting your data. So over here on the left, we've got a bar chart where the categories are sorted by the alphabet. And that's helpful if someone says, well, what's the value of production for onions? You go alphabetically, go, okay, onions, I found them very easily. I can read the value on the chart. But if I were to ask you, what's the 5th highest production? What crop was produced to the 5th highest amount? You'd have a pretty tough time doing that. If instead you sorted the chart based on the production, then you can say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 apples for the 5th highest production crop. Now, of course, this removes a little bit of your ability to easily find a given crop in the chart. But if you needed to do that, you could do it by highlighting that particular item. If that's what's involved in the message of your chart, you could highlight the thing you're calling attention to. People will be able to see it, whether the values are sorted or not, and they'll have the additional information of its context within the range of values. So sorting bar charts, column charts can be helpful. So if you have a message that you want to send to someone, in addition to that highlighting technique, you can also use annotations to call out what you want people to see. And so here in this left chart, there's an annotation for the average value over the time span of production, and then showing how high the highest year was above that average with a number, so that the user doesn't have to look and say, well, let's see, that's 3.7, 2, that's okay, and do some math. You know, that's going to be difficult. It's particularly difficult in this case of this other chart where there's the software has generated a moving average, a line, not a moving average, but the increase over time. Who's going to be able to calculate the percentage increase there? So add an annotation, make that easy for them, especially if that's the message of your chart. So these sound like modern things, but they've been around for a while. This is a chart by William Playfair made in 1801, showing the imports and exports from the British point of view between North America and Great Britain. And he has multiple lines in this chart. He puts in annotations. He has colored filled areas. So the red filled area tells you Britain was importing more than it was exporting, and the green, of course, is good. We're exporting more to North America, except during the Revolution when things went a little crazy. So these ideas have been honed over many, many decades, centuries. Okay, any questions? I'm desperately behind, so I'm going to keep racing.
There's no questions. Keep going.
Okay, composition charts. They show how a whole of something is made up of different parts. And they can also show how composition would change over time. Common composition charts that you've probably seen a ton of are pie charts. And some that you may not have seen are stacked column charts and stacked area charts. However, I will say with the pie charts, it's best not to use them. And I'll tell you why. Here's a pie chart for, assume Europe was made up of, there were only 5 nectarine producers in Europe. So we can show the whole of nectarine production in Europe in one pie chart. And each country gets a wedge that's shaped, sized to represent its portion of that. So that's not so bad. You know, you've got the option here of putting a legend into the chart and saying somewhere in that legend, Spain is the yellow country, or you could just label the wedges, you know, either on the wedge or adjacent to it. You do actually need to have different colors of each wedge so people can tell where one starts and the next one begins, starts and ends. And what's wrong with that? Well, it's very hard for people to intuitively look at a pie wedge and say, oh, that's a certain percentage of the whole. Unless it's half or a quarter, maybe a third, it's very hard. It's actually even hard for people to look at 2 different wedges that are some different locations, different orientations in the pie, and say this one's bigger than the other one. And when you have very small wedges, they're sometimes hard to see, but also hard to differentiate from each other. It can be hard to label some of these wedges. In this chart, it wasn't so bad. I mean, I could have labeled Italy, maybe Greece, Spain right on the wedge, but some of these others that are oriented vertically, it's hard to label them right on the wedge. And when they get small and you get a lot of them, it gets even harder. And if you wanted to show how this changed over time, you would have to have a lot of pie charts, and people would be looking from one to the other to see the change. It doesn't work. So pie charts are familiar. It doesn't mean they need to be, that you need to use them. The worst thing you can do with a pie chart, and here's another cable network that should know better than this, is when people take the wrong type of data and put it into the pie chart. These numbers are listed here as percentages, right? Okay, percentages, great, that they must make up the whole. Well, no, this data was a survey given to somebody where you could check off the reasons you keep a dog. 93% of the people said they kept them to guard, and 45% said for companionship. But those are not exclusive things. So, you know, these are not parts of the whole. If you added up all these percentages, it would be, well, it would be more than 100. So don't do this. Please don't do this. Here's an alternative. Stacked column chart. What you do is you take instead of having wedges, you've got these little baby columns, and you stack them one upon the other. And as you can see here, you can easily then have comparisons from year to year for the same set of values. So it's easy to see here how the production of nectarines changed in Spain. It's a little less easy to see how it changed in Italy because Italy's standing on top of Spain. That's one downside to this, is that the nice baseline level is only going to be available to one of the chart types. But another positive is that the total of the chart, the total of the columns, the stacked columns, lets you see the overall pattern for this group. And you could take the same idea and switch over to percentages, switch from absolute values to relative contributions, relative percentages of the whole. Now you've got 2 things that are sort of anchored at a baseline here. Spain at the bottom and the one that you put at the top, you can also see. This does not show the total change over time, but it does show the change in contribution more clearly. And if you've got a lot of time slices to use here, you can do stacked area charts. This is very much like the line chart, like this Spanish section here at the bottom is pretty much the line for Spain's production filled in below, but then the line for Italy is sort of laid on top of that, and it begins elevated above, above the horizontal. So you could show the stack in absolute terms or in relative terms, like the chart on the right. I encourage you to use these rather than pie charts if you're going to show multiple years worth of results. This is a nice real world example. I can't get into it as much as I'd like, but this is a survey in Britain of what kind of transportation people use at different ages of their lives. So down here, when the children are between 5 and 9, they spend most of their time riding in cars or walking. Eventually, they get old enough to start driving. That's the teal color in the middle. And then people drive a lot until they get older and they stop driving and they start taking taxis. When people are in their 20s, they take the underground and they take the national rail, perhaps, to visit other places. It's a beautiful presentation of a lot of information. You could talk about this for 15 minutes. So I thought that was worth showing. I'm going to skip drilling down in here. We showed most of these types of charts except for the waterfall chart, but I encourage you to go back to the chart chooser afterwards and maybe take a look at these different charts in it and think of how the data that we showed led to those chart selections. I'm not going to show the other two, the parts of the chart chooser, because they only had a few options in them, but let's get right onto those. Distribution charts. They show how data is distributed over one or two variables. Good for seeing clusters and outliers. It's important that your dimension be ordered because you're showing a distribution along the axis of that variable. That dimension's got to be ordered. So the popular forms of this chart are histograms and heat maps and XY scatter plots. Let's look into those. So here's a histogram representing the distribution of traffic tickets issued in New York City per weekday. As with the column charts, the chart needs to go down to 0 because it's the area here of each of these blobs that is moving, that our brain is interpreting. And it's the pattern of moving from one of those areas to the next that shows us the shape of the distribution that is having an impact on us. So in this case, the bins are an ordinal category. There's an ordering to it. It's just days of the week. So you can't rearrange these. You shouldn't change the ordering and the message would be lost. But one thing I'm cautioning you to make sure you understand is the difference between a histogram and a column chart. Column charts have to have spaces in between the bars because it's the lengths of the bars that your brain is interpreting. Whereas with the histogram, it's the sort of shape of the area that's being bounded. So do not try to make a histogram this way. And if you're using software and you don't see a histogram option and you start making column charts, you're going to be making it's going to be hard, and you're going to make a bad chart, a chart that sends the wrong message to the viewer's brains. So be aware of that. So here we're looking at a different variable in the data. This is the ages of the people who were getting the traffic tickets. And so there's a lot more bins. In this chart, every bin is 1 year of age. So there's a little bar here for 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds. And you can see then that the spike of tickets being given happens for people who are in their mid-20s, young 20s. You could label these either in absolute terms, or you could label them with the percentages out of the total number samples in the distribution. Depends on the message you're trying to send. Here's that same data, but it's binned a little more roughly. So the previous data showed a really nice smooth shape, but for some data sets, that data can be very jagged. It could have a lot of noise in it, and you make a better presentation if you group together multiple ranges of values along the x-axis. So you get a smoother shape to your distribution, but you lose your detail. So here we're using 5-year bins. It's possible to stack histograms one on top of the other. In fact, the shape here you may recognize is the same. The top shape is the same as the previous charts, but I'm coloring the male ticket getters in blue and the female ones in pink. My apologies for the anachronistic coloring, but it's adding a dimension of information to the chart, and it's very easy for people to understand, and nothing is lost. You still have that total amount up by looking at the top line.
Say, Ben?
Yes.
Question came in that a number of your charts use color as a differentiation between different quantities. How would you make these accessible?
That's an excellent question, and it is an important one. If you're aware of it, I guess I can't say specifically, but don't put a red and a green thing next to each other and expect everyone to be able to differentiate between them. That would possibly be a case where you could use the fill pattern to highlight the difference between two sections of what you're doing. I'll stop and say, yes, you're absolutely right that in this realm where you're using color, you need to be conscious of that.
Comment in the chat says that person loves the Ito Akabe color universal design palette. So there's a clue there if you want to go.
Wonderful, folks. Take a look at the chat and get that that name. Excellent, thank you. So, well, what if you have more than one dimension that you want to show a distribution across? You can use a heat map. So heat map here, we've got an x-axis and a y-axis making a grid, and each cell of the grid is given a color that shows the value that we're talking about. And of course, you'll need a legend to help people see that. This is a simple ramp from essentially white up to a fully saturated purple. And in this case, it's the age, the population by age bracket in China that we're showing over surveys, censuses of approximately 10 years apart. Really, this should be exactly 10 years apart, but that was the data that I had. So, this works if your axes are ordinal or numerical values, not categorical values, because there's an implied ordering in both of these cases. In addition to showing the color, by the way, you can see here this horizontal band here, there was a population surge, and as you move 10 years and 10 years down the line, you can see that working its way through the data here. So there's some visual information that you can glean from this. You can show numbers in your heat maps to add value. The numbers can be either the absolute, or again, they could be just percentages of the whole. As an example of a real world heat map, I don't like the colors they chose here. This was some internet search data showing the times of day when people were performing more searches. So in the wee hours of the day, there were fewer searches. That's their orange means low, I guess, and the green means the internet is apparently overwhelmed midday on Wednesday by people planning their weekend activities, and then on Friday night when they're out doing stuff, they're not using the internet. So you could tell stories pretty easily with a chart like this, and the colors really calling people's attention to things. Okay, XY scatter plots. Now, scatter plots are where you take every sample point, and it's got two variables in it that you want to use for the x-axis and the y-axis, and those variables determine the position of the point in the chart. And you don't want to connect these points together with lines, because this is not a line graph. There's no continuity. Each sample is isolated, separate. Now, Scatter plots can be used to show both distributions and relationships. Right now, we're going to be talking about the distribution. So here's an example of grape and potato production in Europe in 2016. The x-axis is potato production, and the y-axis is grape production. And when you plot these countries and their production out, you can see that there's actually these groupings. These are the big exporters, I would call them. They produce both crops in large quantities, and they export them. This is the sour grapes category, I'll call it. They don't produce any grapes at all. And these are more northern countries. And then there's the small potatoes countries that don't produce many potatoes, but they do seem to have some of both grapes and potatoes, but probably not enough to do a lot of exporting. So I added these colors. Some software can help you, like Tableau, can help you identify clusters. And what they would be inclined to do would, instead of drawing an oval around this, they would apply a color to each of the sample points that are being shown there to show the category that they're in. There's also the ability to spot outliers. And so here's cabbage production, peach production on the x-axis versus cabbage production on the y-axis. And then the one country that stands out is Turkey, which again is a big exporter of crops. So they produce both and get rid of them. I'm not surprised by this. Whenever I'm eating peaches, I rarely find myself saying, wow, I wish I had some cabbages. So I'm not surprised that people go one way or the other. This is an example of what you can do if you have tons and tons of sample points. This was produced by 538, and it's showing the exit velocity of batted baseballs on the x-axis and the launch angle on the y-axis. And each sample point shows kind of what happened, where purple is a bad result. So the guys that didn't hit it very hard and they hit it at a high angle popped it up, or they hit nice easy fly balls that could turn into outs. The people who hit them low also made a lot of ground outs, but if they hit them hard enough, they might have gotten through the infield and become hits. But the sweet spot, as shown in the bright orange, is when they hit it hard and at just the right launch angle, and it flew over the infield and turned into a double or triple or a home run. This is the data that led to a big change in the way baseball players are trained to strive for particular launch angles and hit the ball really hard. So really compelling picture. And oftentimes, having that much data would make it hard to send a message, but here it's possible. So quickly pivoting to relationship charts. These explore the correlation between two or more variables, good for seeing trends. So once again, we're going to look at some scatter plots and then an enhancement of a scatter plot called a bubble chart. So here's a plot of the same European countries we've been looking at with potato production, but the x-axis in this case is the land area that's being used to produce potatoes, and then the actual production is the y-axis. So I have the software plot a linear correlation between these two, and you can see that that's pretty representative. A lot of the points fall right along that line. I think a viewer wouldn't argue with that. If you say to them a linear correlation, not all viewers know what that means, but they certainly understand what this line means, that everybody's close to that line. And if you say positive correlation, they may not understand that, but they can see it's going up. More land area leads to more production. And the high correlation means, of course, that everything's close to the line. Again, those words don't have meaning to everybody, but it's shown here in a way that people can understand. And you can also spot some outliers here. Germany seems to produce more per hectare than most other countries. And Romania is lagging way behind, so they're not as nearly as efficient. So you could call those out by with annotations or some other highlight to show those countries. And the same is true if you've got nonlinear trends, positive or negative, and the viewers might not understand if you showed the equation for these lines. You could show it, but they will see, oh, and this one, it's going up. If I have a higher GDP by just $5,000 per year per person, the life expectancy will jump up by decades. That can be seen here pretty easily. And similarly, if the GDP goes up, then the birth rate will drop a lot. But you can see in looking at these two charts that this one, the correlation is lower because the points are spread out more. All of this is intuitive visually, where it might not be understandable to someone who doesn't know the terminology. So moving on to a bubble chart, if you've got a third variable that you want to add to the two you're already showing with the position of the x and the y axis, you can plot your points with different sizes. Here the third variable is the percentage of the land on which potatoes are being grown in that country, percentage of the land that's being used for agriculture. This is not a great example because the two countries that use the most of their land for potatoes are actually not producing any more or any less than anyone else. They're right on the pattern. So there's actually no correlation here. I just wanted to show you an example of how the size could be used to show a third variable. Or instead of a size, you could use the color. So here are those same two countries, Belgium and Netherlands, and they're the darker blue, meaning that they've got a higher percentage of their land under potatoes. The color ramp you use does not have to be monochromatic, although it's often a good idea. It's simpler for the eye to understand this. Here's the same thing with a ramp from red, meaning low percentage, to blue, meaning high percentage, and the same countries show up in the blue end of things. This would be more applicable if you had like temperatures, like cold could be shown as blue and red would be shown as hot. So it's you need to be a little bit careful when you're using a multicolor ramp. Here's a nice real world example of the idea of a bubble chart, and this one also has a curve fit to it. On the x-axis, we've got the percentage of the population that uses the internet, and on the y-axis, the percentage of transactions that are performed in cash. You see a very strong correlation here. When there's very little internet access, people do a lot of their transactions with cash. The colors and the sizes indicate the GDP per person in thousands of American dollars. So the poorer countries are going to be in the small dots, which are also shown as yellow if they're between 0 and $10,000 per person. And then the green ones come in. And then finally, when you get down here to the larger country, the countries with more GDP, it varies a little more. They get mixed up a bit more. But I think this chart does a nice job of using the bubble style and sending a very clear message. I hope you can stick with me. I have just a little more to go, and I'm going to grind through it here. That's the end of the big four categories. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can map some data. Lots of times the maps that you make will fit into one of those four categories. If your data has geospatial information in it, you can, some visualization software is now able to draw that, like Tableau can do it for you. And traditionally, geospatial information meant like a latitude and longitude value for a point. So if you had the center of a city as a latitude and longitude, you would plot that on a map. But Tableau now knows how, if you give it the name of a country or a state, it knows where it is in the world and it knows how to draw it. And it can apply the styling to it to convey the information. So you don't necessarily have to use a geographic information system software, which is what you used to have to use, for a simple map. It would still be the way to go if you want to make something more complex. But if you're using Tableau, for instance, you could take your very popular potato production data and show it in a choropleth. It's a word meaning, well, it's from the Greek. So, pleth is like for plethora. It's showing the amount as a color in an area. So here's our color ramp. And again, Germany produces the most potatoes, no surprise. But you get the other benefits of the map. The names of the countries are there, the orientation, people can see a pattern. Oh, there's this certain latitude where potatoes grow well. Things like that can can be evident in a representation on a map. But that's not the only way you can show values. You could show them as circles, sort of like with the bubble chart. You could change the color or the size or even the symbol that's being used, that is being shown on top of each of the countries. You could show more than one variable here in the map, and in fact, you could have a choropleth coloring the country, and then you could put a circle on top of that if you wanted. Here is an example with the cities as where they're all of the data had in it was the name of the city and the country and the population. So Tableau was able to say, okay, I know where that city is, and then I was able to color the circles based on the country. So Brazil cities are all here in red, and then the size was dictated by the population. So you get a nice presentation there. It wasn't very hard to do at all. It could be good for agricultural data if you're out in the field collecting samples or whatever. You know, if you have data that's located somewhere in the world, you can map it, and it tells people a lot sometimes. Or you could try to tell them too much. Here's an example where someone said, okay, let's put everything in this one chart, everything that we might possibly want. Okay, you got these cities in Japan, and each one produces a certain amount of industrial export, which is indicated by the size of these pie charts, and the types of exports are, I shouldn't say exports, the products that are made are broken down by the different categories up here, and they're linking this to the locations of power plants. So they've got power plants, the hydroelectric are shown in blue, conventional in red, and atomic in black, and the filled ones are big ones and the unfilled ones are small. This is well-intentioned, but it's an example of how you can really do too much. If this was a poster on a wall where people could stand and stare at it for 15 minutes, then it might work. But if it's in your talk, no one's going to be able to get anything out of it, as you have to move on to the next thing. So let's talk just a little bit about that. If you've got too much to say, that for it to fit into one chart, don't hesitate to use multiple charts. Think of the message you want each chart to send, and then order the messages in a way that tells the story, that presents the bigger picture that you want. You just have to be sure as you move from one chart to the next that you keep the coloring consistent. So in this previous example, there was color used for these different industries. In some of our other examples, the countries had colors. You have to keep that consistent. If you've got things listed alphabetically in one chart, list them alphabetically in the next. And you don't be afraid to repeat some things from one chart and another chart to sort of tie them all together. Much better to have to show a few charts and spend a little less time on each one than it is to dwell too long on one that just is never going to be clear. All right, there's the chart chooser again. We've seen it. I'm going to move right on to that's a link for that chart chooser. This is the original blog posting where he introduced it. Again, if you search for Dr. Abella's chart chooser, you will find many copies of it. I just wanted to give a nod to where it came from. There's a bit of discussion here about what the purpose was. And here's a couple books that I'd recommend. These first two are good if you're learning how to make visualizations. You want some examples. This third one by Edward Tufte is one of a series of 3 books. They're very famous books. It's inspirational. It's not a how-to in any way, but you should at least take a look at this book. It's great. It's great to make you think about visualization and to inspire you to make better ones.